Hey team, welcome back to the show. Today I am joined by my man Brandon DaCruz to talk about bringing up weak parts with body part specialization phases. Brandon, it has been a long time, dude. It's just crazy to me to think now that there's people who listening to the podcast who might not have listened to any of our episodes because I feel like for so long we were doing like a weekly episode there. So it is great to have you back, man. What's been going on with you as of late?
And Jeremiah, I have to say, dude, it is such a pleasure to be back. I feel that at one time I was almost like a co-host on here. I think we have, if any of the listeners are new, if you go back to the archives, we have at least 60 episodes. We documented our entire coaching process together, of you and I working together, your photo shoot, your posts, your building phases. And so we really got to document a lot of your progress, both as a physique athlete as well as a coach. And I'm immensely proud of what we were able to accomplish and how much you grew during that time. But things are going well on my end. I feel incredibly blessed. This has been my biggest and most productive year in business to date in terms of my personal business. From coaching perspective, the podcast has grown. I just got the analytics yesterday. So just for those out there to know, Chasing Clarity, it's grown in terms of listenership by about 72% more followers, and then 102% more listening time, essentially. And so that's just it's a huge investment of time. You yourself as a podcaster, and you were someone that encouraged me heavily to do my own podcast. You had me on so many times that it was like, all right, I might as well. I'm getting kind of good at this stuff, so might as well do this for myself. So besides those two things, man, I'm blessed. As you know, the podcasters or the listeners, if they don't listen to any other shows, I had relocated from the Northeast where I initially was kind of managing two careers. I was doing online nutrition coaching, and then I also had an executive position in the sports nutrition industry where I mostly did research and development behind supplement products. Now I've went full-time into coaching as of the last 3 years. I relocated to the greater Nashville, Tennessee area. And I'm just living a blessed life with my partner, just pouring into my clients, my athletes, and all the people that trust in me to bring them to the best version of themselves. And I'm incredibly thankful to God that I'm in the position I am. We were talking off air, and one of the things I thought of when we went to go get on this podcast was, when you first started asking me to come on your podcast, I had a full-time job, and I can't tell you the times that I had just gotten off like a Zoom call with like a purchaser or an ingredient specialist, and I was like trying to cram this in. I was so stressed being on podcasts and stuff. I used to very much be fearful of public speaking, and it was something that was really outside of my comfort zone. And it was individuals like yourself that I had a good connection with, I really aligned with, that made me feel comfortable. So I'm incredibly grateful to you for your friendship, for your looking to me for guidance, and then also for the opportunity to be back on, man. I hope we're able to deliver a ton of value to your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, I feel like I should have done a better intro now because, again, I'm realizing that people might be listening out who don't actually know who you are. I feel like you've been such a big part of, I mean, for people who don't know, like, I think you are probably the single biggest influence I've had in terms of like my growth and development and like people I've learned from as a coach. I would say like you and Dom Kuz are the people who have had the biggest influence on that. And like we worked together for years, made tremendous progress in my physique. So I feel like so much of the way we coach, our entire team coaches, like Andrea and I did the mentorship with you, like so much of the way we coach, both like the X's and O's, but also like the mindset and like the service that I think the quality service needs to be provided has come from you. So definitely like one of my very biggest mentors, of course. Like, I'm honored to call you a great friend now as well. So it's really cool to have you on. But again, I feel like I don't know if my intro actually did you justice. I feel like if you're not familiar with Brandon, please go back and listen to our episodes because there are so many just incredible deep dives. Your podcast, the Chasing Clarity podcast, I don't think that anyone else does as good of a job just going on these insanely deep dives into topics as Brandon does. Podcast is incredible. So if you really want to get deep into things, as I'm sure we're going to today, I highly recommend checking it out. But let's get into some body part specialization talk and deep into that. I imagine everyone listening has 1 to 2 muscle groups they've been trying for years to bring up, but just can't seem to change. And I think at this point, most people blame genetics. And I would argue that genetics aren't as fault as much as most people think. You just need a better approach to your training. So again, today's going to be a deep dive into how to bring up your weak points. Brandon, what's your take on why this topic is important?
Yeah, I think that this topic is incredibly important because I think there's been a misinterpretation of what really is causing weak body parts. And a lot of people are looking at it from a genetic perspective, as you alluded to, Jeremiah. They think that the reason that they're unable to grow a body part or have yet to do so is because of their genetics. And the unfortunate aspect of that is we have to think about it from a human psychology perspective. Once you put that self-limiting belief on yourself that you are unable to do something as a result of having a genetic proclivity proclivity or a genetic defect, essentially, you are going to be unable to do that because our psychology influences our physiology. And what I found over the past like 15 plus years that I've been coaching is that it's rarely genetics holding someone back from building muscle or developing a specific body part. It's the way that they're training that muscle. So this isn't to say that genetics don't matter, because we all have different structural differences. So you can have different muscle belly lengths. You can have different muscle fiber orientation. You can have different insertion points. And we see that even just on how someone looks. You can, I have a good friend, Dave McConey, that always does like body part measurements, and he'll do comparisons between different individuals, whether that be fitness influencers or other, natural competitive bodybuilders. And there are individuals that have the same measurements, but because of their insertion points, the origin of their muscles, their muscle belly lengths, or even the shape of their musculature, their limb lengths, they can look completely different. So someone can have the same size arms or delts or whatever it may be, and due to their structure, due to their anthropometrics, they can look completely different. So this isn't to say that genetics don't influence it, but I really do think that this is an important topic to cover, because there are alternatives and more optimal ways about going about training program design that many people have overlooked. And giving yourself the scapegoat that it's all genetics is really doing yourself a disservice, especially if you want to get past that like intermediate level of a trainee, essentially.
Okay. No, absolutely. And I think that is a very important point where like someone's muscle insertions, for example, can make your physique look completely different. And that's like one thing we have clients do that I found to be quite helpful is when you're starting the coaching process, and a lot of times where we assess this over time, like, hey, give me a few pictures of kind of what your goal physique looks like, what a physique that inspires you looks like. I can't just snap my fingers and give you that physique, but it gives me a good idea of like how hard I need to push you and kind of where your head is at and what you really want out of this, better than you just telling me like, oh, I want to be lean and I want to build some muscle. But also understand like we can grow your biceps, but your biceps might not look like this person's, for example, right? Like you might have really low insertions, you might have, or like your calves, like you might have really high calf insertions. That's my excuse for having small calves, right? Those are the ones that genetics do matter way more than everything else, probably.
That and forearms.
But it's calves and forearms, yeah, those are the two. But it sounds like, if I'm correct, more often than not, it's less of a genetic limitation than people think, and more of they might not understand how to train effectively. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I think that we have to realize that genetics do come into play, but if you actually look at the research on genetics, and that would be called like non-responsiveness or non-responders. Non-responders to resistance training interventions are extremely rare. And so we really can't use, genetics as a scapegoat, when in reality, most people have absolutely no idea what their genetics are. And even if you did, you can't change them. So what you should be doing, everyone out there that's listening to this podcast today, should be looking to maximize your potential to the best of your ability. Now, what I see within the context of coaching, and then also just having been in gyms for 20 plus years, what I see far more commonly is that the trainee simply hasn't been applying enough high quality volume to that muscle. They're not training the muscle with good execution and control. They're not prioritizing it within the training session. A lot of times they're leaving it to the end because it's kind of like a muscle group that they don't have fun training. So they leave it to like the end. They never prioritize it. They're not accumulating enough progressive overload over time, and they're not training it with sufficient frequency. And any one of those could hold you back from maximally developing a muscle group or muscle groups, let alone all of those together. And so what a lot of times is it's an amalgamation of all these factors that are contributing to weak or underdeveloped muscle groups. And I'm going to be honest with you, I think that this is, something that I've been really stewing over lately, because there's a lot of trends in the industry. And right now we're in a low volume trend. And I really think that we're going to start seeing more and more people with lagging body parts over the next few years, because low volume training is extremely popular right now. And many lifters find the idea of doing less and gaining more appealing. But there's multiple issues with that narrative. And really, when we look at it, the loudest proponents of low volume training are very advanced trainees who built the majority of their muscle mass earlier on in their career. And a lot of times they use high volume approaches. And now they're gaining at a snail's pace, but they're already heavily muscled. So people are imitating what they're doing now instead of recognizing that higher volume built their physiques in the first place. Another thing that I really want to get across to individuals is, in no other sport or athletic endeavor do you get more progress from doing less and training less hard. In every other thing, like very few things in physiology work that way, where you're going to do less work and you're going to train with less intensity and get better at something. And then whether someone agrees with this or not, and this is something that I see, and I'm especially seeing lately within the general population, not only are they not doing enough quality, but they're not doing enough quantity of work. So we're having an issue at both things. They're not training intense enough, they're not training enough. And really, whether you agree with it or not, the vast majority of the literature shows a dose-response relationship with more weekly volume producing more hypertrophy. However, the caveat that many people overlook is that many times that volume is done in close proximity to failure, and these are controlled trials. So if someone is doing, say, 4 to 6 poorly executed sets per week for a muscle group, and they're saying that it just won't grow because it's genetic, they're jumping to the wrong conclusion. Really what it comes down to is that a lot of people need a greater dose, but also a more potent dose. So meaning we need to do more total work, but more quality work within that. So you're going to have to do a little bit more volume, and you're going to really have to dial up that intensity dial. That's one thing many people are lacking. And I'm sure as a coach yourself, I know that this is something I constantly see with the videos that I analyze from clientele. They're not as close to failure as they think they are. They're not losing rep speed. I'm not seeing the loss in velocity. They're nowhere close to failure. So if I say, hey, we're going to start out at 2 reps in reserve for week 1 of this mesocycle, a lot of times you're 5 reps in reserve. And I know that because I've done, for lack of a better word, shit testing, where I'm like, listen, we're going to take the governor off. I don't want you to count reps. You're just going to send me a video at the last set of your workout on this exercise, or you're going to go in the next day and do the same exercise that you did yesterday. So technically there should be some accumulated fatigue that pours over into the next day, but I just have them take 1 set and take it to the fucking house. And a lot of times they're 5 to 8 reps greater than they were the day before when they said they were 0 to 2 reps in reserve. So this is we're going to go over this in totality, but I think that it's a lack of training intensity, a lack of training volume, and then there's many things that are getting misconstrued for genetics, which is really just a scapegoat.
Absolutely. I actually was considering talking with you about volume instead of the body part specialization, actually. So that's funny that you brought that up, because that's something I've been thinking about a lot since our last podcast with Jeff as well. The training intensity is so overlooked. I think almost everyone starts working with a coach thinking they train hard, and there's almost always so much more on the table. A story that I share often with clients, because I get a lot of like, dude, it's been like 6 weeks and you're still telling me that I'm not training hard enough on this movement. I share so often when I was working with you. I think we started in 2022. I was doing I think it was a cable chest press or cable chest fly with lengthened partials. And I remember every week for like 12 weeks, you would be like, and I was taking those to the point where it was like, we literally can't move, which was such a good learning experience for me, because again, this was just like 2022, 2023. Like I'd already been training since I was 16, 17. Right. And I learned so much about training intensity during that time too. And I remember again, it was like 12 weeks. You were like, nah, dude, you still got a little bit more. You still got a little bit more.
Well, here was the biggest thing. You weren't accumulating, you had mental fatigue, but you didn't have systemic physical fatigue that was accumulating. And here's the thing. I kept looking at your performance week on and week out, and you kept adding reps. So we have to realize that recovery is a return to baseline performance, and you were still exceeding that. So I think that a lot of times at that time, especially say 2 or 3 years ago, we were looking at a lot of the models by RP Strength and by, say, Revive Stronger, and they were these preset proactive deloads. So you would do 5 weeks of a mesocycle, automatically deload on week 6. And I haven't been an advocate of that. And I think that that comes from the fact that much of my mentoring was from Dr. Scott Stevenson. He was very big into reactive deloading, meaning that you're looking at biofeedback, you're looking at what he calls a perceived recovery score, and then you're really doing things based off the individual's biofeedback and performance indicators. So if there isn't a necessity to deload, there's no benefit nor need or necessity to do so. And so I'll ride someone out until they need a deload. And I think that that allows me to get more productive mesocycles. But one thing you're alluding to is that I pushed you probably further at that time than you thought you can go to, but it gave you an internal, governor of what you were really capable of, and it helped you re-gauge things. And I'll tell you, if I go back to my own training career, I learned the most with the training partners that left me in the fucking dust. I told you this privately recently, I think on our last call with Jeff Hone, is that one of my training partners was an Olympia level athlete, and he could handle volume that was through the roof. And then I had another individual that I worked with for a long period of time, and he was my training partner, and his name's Kyle Wilkes, and now he's an Olympia level coach, and he was a monster in the gym. And I think that just being around people that were far greater in terms of genetic proclivities as well as intensity than I was, it made me push myself to the degree where I thought I literally had nothing left. I'd be on the floor, I'd be gasping in between sets, and I was just trying to keep up with them. And I think that was a really good lesson for knowing how hard I need to push myself to maximize my physique. Not saying everyone has to do that every set of every workout of every week, but you need to get close to the sun to know how hot it is. And you really need to take yourself there to know that's the only way we can gauge your actual accurate proximity to failure if you've actually failed.
Yeah. And there, I mean, what I was referring to when you were saying, you were telling me I had more was in the videos I was sending you, I was like, man, I couldn't have possibly squeezed out any more movement there. You were like, dude, I think you could have squeezed out another like partial rep there. And then the next week I'd be like, damn, he was right. I actually did have more. And then so I often share that story with clients when people are like, how could I possibly do more? It's like, I get it, I've been here. Here's like a similar experience I had, but there's typically so much more in the tank. But that is a really good point as well with same thing around us pushing, because before that I was like I would change mesocycles, like I would deload every 4 weeks. But similarly, that's another big thing that I learned from you is there are so often like a client may feel like, hey, we need to deload. I feel a little bit fatigued. But if we look objectively at their like, hey, we're actually progressing quite well still, like nothing in our biofeedback is actually telling us we really are in a place where we glaringly need to deload. This is actually so productive, right? So we want to kind of look at that alongside the subjective. To bring it back to the genetics thing quick, I think that in a way genetics do impact weak points, but not how people consider. So for example, like glutes are a common one where it's like everybody in my family just has flat asses. Now, I think people interpret that as for some reason like the muscle fibers in our glutes can't grow as well as the muscle fibers in our quads. Now, that's not the case, I don't think typically, or in my experience isn't the case when we learn how to train properly. What may be going on is everyone in your family, like your limb lengths are similar, right? Y'all have very long femurs and short tibias, for example. So like your squat patterns, we tend to be very quad dominant. Like if we're squatting, we tend to be very upright. Our quads grow quite easily. But it's not a matter of like, again, the actual muscle fibers, the tissue in our glutes won't grow as well if we apply a good stimulus. It's just the way that you're built. You don't, you naturally might bias your quads more. Again, not that your glutes can't grow, but we need to just understand how to change your execution, better bias that, or again, like spend more time driving quality volume there. I think that when it comes to the genetic side of things, like that is an important variable. But again, it's like not that you're cursed to not be able to grow muscle there.
I couldn't agree more. I think that there's certain things, not only from an anthropometric perspective, but also just a movement and technical proficiency perspective. Like a lot of times it is execution based. It's not that that person cannot grow that tissue. It is that they're not executing it properly. And if we look, we can even just look at like correlates. So meaning what is correlational in terms of the individuals that I work with. And often I'll have this conversation about weak point training before I get them into a specialization cycle. And when they're talking about specific body parts, and a lot of times it's someone's back, it's someone's hamstrings, someone's glutes, it tends to be like postural or posterior muscles, but also those are the same body parts that they have a poor mind and muscle connection with, and they have poor technical execution with. So they're not feeling that muscle in that target tissue. And it's not all about sensation, but you should have some degree of a mind and muscle connection, especially on isolation exercises. That doesn't mean on every compound movement that you're going to feel, a deep squeeze in, the glutes or whatever it may be. But I think that a lot of times people are offloading the actual stimulus to other, whether it be target tissues or to other joints. And they're actually hitting surrounding musculature rather than that target tissue. And so that is a big impediment to being able to actually grow that. You need to be able to connect with that muscle, know what it means to actually train that tissue, especially this is a concept that I'm always thinking about. In a squat, are we actually taking the quadriceps and the glutes to failure? Or are we only really getting, depending on someone's actual biomechanic setup, are we only taking one of those tissues to failure? So a lot of times people are looking at a movement, they're like, all right, it's compound, it hits, we could do a bench press, it's going to hit my chest, my front delt, my anterior delts, and it's going to hit my triceps. But really, we can argue based on if you're a delt dominant presser or you're a pec dominant presser, what actual muscle and what fibers are actually going to failure and actually getting sufficient stimulus. Because if you're counting it, now we have a lot of literature that is looking at direct sets, indirect sets, and like a crossover within these things. And I think that a lot of times we really need to look at the individual themselves and say, we got to count volume based on how you execute a movement and where you are actually able to deliver that stimulus. What muscle is being predominantly hit by that movement in and of itself?
Absolutely. And that's again where the things like your limb links come into play big time, where for you versus me, like a leg press or a squat pattern might be quite different. It might be more glutes for you, it might be more quads for me, or vice versa. Cool. Anything else in terms of why weak points develop before we move on that you wanted to throw in there?
Yeah, just a few things. So I think that exercise order and session structure is often poorly configured in those that are really complaining or reporting a struggling, like a weak muscle group. I often notice that like the weak body part is trained last. And what we have to realize about that is that at the end of your session is when fatigue is highest. So rather than do that, you should be doing it first when output and focus are highest. And a lot of things that I notice are like volume allocation is backwards. A lot of people train based on two things: what they're best at, and then also what they like to do for entertainment rather than progression. So I'm often having conversations with clients. Let's train for progression, not novelty and entertainment. And then also let's look at this as a financial investment, an investment of your time and your adaptive resources. And let's allocate more of that volume budget to your weaker muscle groups rather than your stronger muscle groups. A lot of people like to, that expression, double down on your strengths. That's often what you shouldn't do in resistance training if you're trying to maximize your physique. A lot of people, their volume allocation is exactly backwards. They train their strongest muscles the most because they like training the muscles that feel good and that look good, and then the weak muscles receive the lowest volume and the weakest stimulus. So a lot of times we have to rebalance that essentially, or reallocate the distribution of your total volume budget in a manner that makes more sense for what you're actually struggling.
Yeah. I think one of the hardest things to work through there is it can oftentimes feel like, for example, I can think of a couple clients where I'm really working on this with the glutes right now. And we've really had to strip things back in terms of like the loading they're using for a movement, like a split squat, for example. Now we're going to be able to get better, and even working on things like, hey, your internal rotation at your hip. Like we want to focus on improving this, and like little things that in the moment, it doesn't feel like it's like, holy shit, my glutes are wrecked or my lower body is wrecked. It might not even feel like your lower body training at the moment is like as stimulative as a whole as it was if you just like destroyed your quads like you normally would. Over time, though, this is going to get us in a position where we are going to be able to build much better glutes, but it can almost feel like a step back, I think, sometimes versus like, well, I'm really good at doing this thing, so I can just go back to that. And like in the short term, I get a little bit more of a dopamine hit from like feeling like I'm doing what I'm good at. But there will be a time where you just kind of feel like you suck at it as you are mastering these new movements or movement patterns. Cool. All right. So, how do you decide when a client is actually ready for specialization versus just needing to add more tissue across the board? Because I think it's easy for someone who's like brand new to hear this and like, oh, sick. Like, but I would love to just do a specialization phase. Is that the best approach for us, or where's your head at there?
Yeah, so when I'm deciding whether a client is ready for a specialization phase, I'm looking at a few specific indicators because honestly, specialization is not something I use with everyone. Jeremiah, in your case, you came to me with over 10 years of resistance training. You're already a high level coach. I did actually, in the beginning, I didn't use specialization with you, and then I transitioned you into a specialization cycle once I had run you through some baseline mesocycles and really seen and been able to gauge your response to training. But in my mind, this is an advanced tool for intermediate to advanced trainees. So the first thing I assess is a person's overall training age and development through a needs analysis. And by training age, I do not mean how many years you've been in the gym. I actually mean how proficient are you in the gym. So there's many people that come to me with 5 to 10 years of training experience, but they're still in that beginner like cusp to like intermediate when they think they're advanced. And to be honest with you guys, you don't want to be advanced because once you get advanced, like someone like myself or Jeremiah, your progress is moving at a snail's pace. So a lot of times when I tell someone, hey, I think you're much more intermediate than you think, and I'm trying to present that as like, hey, there's an opportunity to learn. You should look at this like with a white belt mentality. They kind of take offense to it. And then I explain to them like, you have a very big margin of like an ability to make progress. So let's really flip this narrative on its head. The other thing is, if a client still needs more muscle everywhere, specialization is not the answer. They'll grow better by continuing to run a more balanced hypertrophy phases and building their foundation. I also look for whether there's a clear disproportion in their physique, meaning that is there one muscle group that's legitimately behind the rest, not just one that feels small to them, because a lot of times, especially the individuals that I work with a wide breadth of kind of people of different backgrounds, but the one key characteristic with every client that I work with, including yourself when you were on my roster, is that they're high achievers and high performers. That doesn't mean that they're high-level physique competitors, although I do have several IFBB pros and several high-level amateurs. However, I have people from a corporate executive background that are running very large companies. They just have the mindset of high-achieving, high performance, or type A. However, for every gimme, there's a gotcha. And so with that type of mentality and that type of mindset, a lot of times they're their harshest critic. So a lot of times it's much more likely for them to be overly analytical of their physiques and a little bit critical of themselves. And so a lot of times they're like, well, I don't like how this looks. But it doesn't mean that that's in clear disproportion with your physique. So before I ever consider specialization, I'm going to evaluate whether that client has actually been training that muscle correctly. So are they applying enough high quality effective volume? Are they placing that muscle early in a session and prioritizing it when it's fresh? And have they been progressing loads or rep over time? If the answer to any of these is no, you don't need specialization. You need better structure and better habits within your current program, or you need to transition to a program that's going to prioritize that. Another thing that I really consider if I'm going to transition someone into a specialization cycle is their recovery bandwidth, because specialization increases volume for a target muscle, which means we have to drop other muscles to maintenance. So if someone's sleep, their nutrition, or their stress is inconsistent, we first need to dial those variables in so that they have the capacity to recover from that. The last category that I really look to is for physique competitors or people that are looking for photo shoots, but specifically with physique competitors, because I do work still with a good portion of them, is I'm looking at judges' feedback. That's usually what's going to make the decision clear for me, as they will receive feedback with, essentially what needs to be done to win. So for example, I'm currently taking one of my clients, Wes, through a back specialization cycle. And how we made that determination that he needed that was this summer, he went to North Americans, which is a pro qualifier for an IFBB pro card, and he got second in 2 categories. He got second in masters and then second in open men's physique. That's 1 spot away from a pro card in both categories. Now, the issue was that when we got his feedback, the judges were like, listen, you won from the front, your conditioning was spot on, your front shots are very well developed, but you need more back. So specifically, they wanted more back width. And so we've been focusing on a back specialization cycle the last few months, as that's what's going to be needed to earn his IFBB pro card. So a lot of times, if there's someone that has more on the line, and I don't want to make this sound like someone's goals is more important than the other, but someone's specialization makes more sense based on what that person is going to have to present from a physique perspective. And we often have to do our needs analysis. So not only am I looking at someone in a fasted state to see their baseline level of musculature, but I also like seeing them post-workout. That was something I had you do, Jeremiah, almost every single week that you worked with me. And I really want to see what someone looks like in a fed state. So they have a meal in them, they have hydration, they have sodium, but they also have a pump. I want to see what muscle groups. A lot of times I'm doing it after specific workouts to see, do they actually get a pump in that muscle? And it isn't because the pump is an indicator of growth, but it's more of an indicator of, does that person have a good mind to muscle connection? Because if someone has a good mind to muscle connection, they generally get a better pump in those target muscles. And also I want to see what their physique looks like in a non-fasted state, because some people, their physique wildly changes. I can say that about yourself. When you wake up, you're pretty flat. We're also very tall. You and I are both 6'2" and over. So we look kind of stringy, to be honest. No matter how much muscle we put on, when we're in a fasted state, you're not going to see your muscles come to life. But when I used to have you you took them in pretty much every gym in Arizona at one point. But when you used to take those post-workout photos, I was able to see how certain muscles were developing and what were lagging behind. And so it really is both a visual analysis, but then also speaking with them, looking at their training, really analyze their logbook, and then also looking at training videos to see how proficient is this person, and specialization is not something that applies to everyone. It is, does this client need this, and does it match their actual goals moving forward?
I think that's very, very well put. Do you find that, so like for me, when we got into specialization, I thought you were going to tell me, hey, your legs need to come up, because as you said, my perspective is always like, I have small legs, I kind of have like skinny legs. And it was actually chest and quads for you are the things that need to come up. Like when we were doing the photo shoot prep, those were kind of the first things that disappeared. Do you find that when we're looking at like male versus female clients, are like women or men typically ready to get into a specialization phase sooner? Like just thinking generally, I would think that if we're looking at like a balanced physique and like typically what's like quote unquote desirable, I find for men, we have upper body and lower body being quite important. Whereas for a lot of women, again, it depends, but like a lot of times, like, hey, chest, arms just aren't as much of a priority for us. So we might be in a good place to enter specialization sooner. Do you think there's a disparity there or not really? Does that question make sense?
It does. I think that it really comes down to the demographic of clients that you're working with. So I'm going to give you some examples because I have covered the breadth of clients over the years. Say 2013, when I first started coaching online, to 2018, it was mostly just physique competitors. And that I utilize a lot of specialization cycles. That's really where I honed the craft of specialization cycles. And I initially found out about them by Lyle McDonald. And the irony of this is I literally talk to Lyle on Zoom, like on a weekly basis. We're great friends. He comes on the podcast, but he was the first person that introduced me to this concept. And honestly, when we talk training, he doesn't really go into specialization cycles that much anymore. And you may have changed his thoughts on that, so I don't want to speak on his thoughts, but that's who initially introduced them to me. And so in that phase, because I was working with bikini athletes or eventually wellness athletes, it became very specialization focused because I was really trying to bring intermediate athletes to advanced training status and really work on specific muscle groups. So with men's physique, it was a lot of delt and arm cycles, specialization cycles, a lot of chest and upper back for width and V-tapers. And then as I got more into other clientele with more gen pop, I realized that specialization wasn't warranted or beneficial to a lot of the clientele that I was working with because they just hadn't trained sufficiently hard enough. Maybe they thought they did. They worked with a group training program, but they had never really experienced individualized coaching where they were getting their videos analyzed, where they were getting feedback, where they were getting actual auto-regulated programming from someone that had experience. I spent 3 years working full-time in a gym, and then also at this point, I'm 13 years into online coaching. And so I think my opinions have changed, and I don't think we could exactly dichotomize it but between sexes, but I will say that this is another consideration of this. So I just spoke about the physiology of what I'm looking at. Another major component of this is once I've built a relationship with a clientele like yourself, I want to know your preferences. There are certain people, so Jeremiah, for instance, I have certain men that they don't care about their leg development. They want, to train legs once a week, but they want their upper body to look like a great beach body. And they've been training long enough where they're not making global progress anymore. So that's where we have to meet someone in the middle. In my programming and my coaching philosophy, I want to strike a balance between what's optimal for that person's goal and what's realistic for that person's lifestyle, as well as what is a great balance for what that person prefers, especially from a physique perspective, because there's been many clients that I've said, hey, listen, you would really benefit. Like if it was up to me with a lot of the women that I work with, I would do a lot of delt and glute cycles, a lot of delt and quadricep cycles, but some women don't want flaring quads. And I understand that. I'll give you a perfect example. Jane, who's my partner, has a really advanced physique. She has been second at nationals before, one spot away from a pro card. She does not want her quads developed any longer or any more than they were. And so we backed down on that. Although I think her physique, if we were going to put her back on stage, I would have to specialize back to quadriceps because we have detrained that area. However, she really wants, right now we're in a specialization cycle for glutes and delts. And so that's what she truly wants. And the delts were more of my input as a coach, but she really wants bigger glutes. So I'm going to do that for her. So I think that from a coaching perspective, we really have to meet someone in the middle. We have to make sure that they hit certain prerequisites, meaning they need to be an intermediate or advanced trainee. They have to have a meaningful amount of muscle built already, because if you don't have enough tissue, you need to do balance programs and you need to build a substantial amount of tissue. You need to have some type of indication that there's a clear objective lagging muscle group. You have to have your lifestyle and your recovery in line to be able to support that extra workload. But then that's where we go beyond the X's and O's of coaching, just from a training sets and reps perspective and a training program design perspective. And we say, hey, what do you truly want to look like? And that's a great example you do with the photos where you're saying, all right, what is your goal physique? Well, if your goal physique requires extra tissue in your delts and your glutes, then that's what we're going to do. So it is really about striking the balance between what I think is best from a coaching perspective and then what that client wants.
Very, very well put. So how many muscle groups do you realistically think we could specialize in at once?
Yeah, so in practice, most trainees can realistically specialize in one or maybe two muscle groups at a time. And that's assuming they're intermediate to advanced and they have the recovery bandwidth to handle it. Specialization works because we're reallocating resources. And that includes resources like your volume budget, your energy resources, and your recovery capacity. And that's going towards a specific muscle. What I often see is that people are trying to specialize in 3 or 4 areas simultaneously. And that's actually defeating the purpose because you're removing the very thing that makes specialization cycles effective, which is focus overload without exceeding systemic maximum recoverable volume. So I find personally that specializing on one muscle is ideal for most people. Then specializing on 2 is possible when overlap is minimal, but 3 is almost always too much. So really how I look at it, it's almost like a sliding spectrum, essentially. So the more advanced someone is, the more true this becomes because advanced lifters require a higher stimulus to continue progressing. And this often requires that they either need to train harder, need to train more intensely, more often, or they need to train with more volume. And when recovery is in a good place, you can drive a disproportionately higher stimulus into weak muscle groups without burning yourself. And that's the whole point of specialization. But if you are someone that's trying to do that globally, like to your whole body, like some people will come to me and be like, hey, can we do my back, my chest, my quadriceps, my hamstrings? It's like, first of all, you're not going to have the time to do that. You're not going to have the desire and you're going to be burnt out 4 weeks into the cycle. However, that's not even conducive for the goal at hand. The other thing we need to consider is the size of the muscle and the systemic stress that it produces. So specializing in delts and arms is completely different than specializing in quads and back. Smaller muscles are going to produce less central nervous system fatigue. They're going to get less systemic stress from training them. So they're easier to specialize without compromising things. However, if you were to look at things that require higher degrees of loading, and they're going to cause more systemic fatigue versus local fatigue. Large muscle groups like your quads and your back create massive systemic stress, whereas smaller muscle groups like your delts, your arms and calves do not. So really what I advise not doing is specializing in two large muscle groups together, because that's really counterproductive. And so I find that the best approach is to specialize on one large muscle group by itself, like your quadriceps or your back, or one large muscle and one smaller muscle, like glutes and side delts, or you do two small muscle groups like your delts and your biceps. Sometimes, I've done a lot of cycles with advanced trainees that are really dialed in. So one example would be Anthony Scalzo, who was an IFBB pro. We used to run sometimes delts and arms, so delts and biceps and triceps. But that really comes down to the considerations of what type of movements are we utilizing within that? What is the session structure looking like? And then also, does this align with the athlete's goals and weak point demand?
Okay. So it sounds like, I guess to bring this back to a real world example, I actually think I got this from you and our coaching together. When a client wraps up a training phase or we're moving on to a new phase, I'll send them over like, hey, an end of mesocycle review, basically. I did take this from you.
Yeah. I've been doing that for years.
Yes. And I thought that was great. One of the questions I'll ask is something along the lines of top 1 to 2 priority muscle groups for the next phase. And as you kind of said, sometimes I'll get like glutes. I'd like to bring out my delts, but also like I'd love to bring out my quads and my lats and my arms as well. And it's like, and hamstrings. It's like, okay, so basically our entire body here. And yes, I think as it is very important to understand when we're talking about specialization, like it is so easy to get carried away with like, I'm just going to destroy my lower body, but then, oh man, I really want to bring up my lats and my arms and my delts more too. And you do kind of we have to pick and choose what is the priorities. And we'll discuss this more later, but be okay with some of these other tissues being more around maintenance. Cool. Okay. Brandon, we are like halfway through my outline. I don't know how much more time you have, but if you would prefer to make this a 2-parter.
Yeah, we can absolutely do a 2-parter. I will have about, let me see what time it is. I have about 30 minutes left that I can keep going.
Okay.
We could definitely make this a 2-parter though.
Okay, cool. So we kind of touched on how we're choosing what we're prioritizing. Let's touch on frequency. So if I'm correct here, when we're entering a body part specialization phase, would you say that frequency is kind of the main driver to speed up growth? Fill me in there.
Yeah, so frequency is definitely one of the main levers that we use during specialization, especially in how I construct specialization cycles, because increasing training frequency allows us to distribute volume more evenly across a week. We're able to increase our total high quality work without the set quality falling off within each session. And we're able to apply a greater growth stimulus more often while staying within recoverable limits. So for advanced trainees, this is huge because as you get more trained, you can't just keep stacking 12 to 15 sets into one session and expect it to produce better gains. That is something that often newer trainees will look back, and we can even talk about this ourselves. When I first started training, it was in vogue to do like Jay Cutler workouts. I started training in 2004, 2005. Jay Cutler is just rising up to the level of the Mr. Olympia, and he used to do 20 sets per body parts per session. And so it was a bro split type of mentality. And I early realized that I just couldn't recover from that. And also that the latter sets within a session were lagging because I was just so exhausted. So that's really where frequency comes in, as it allows you to break that volume into multiple exposures where you can actually maintain a high level of training performance.
Okay. So frequency in itself isn't necessarily more conducive to growth outside of just a way to drive more volume. Like if we're looking at, okay, let's say that hypothetically we're doing 10 sets across the course of a week. And let's say we split that into 2 sessions versus 3 sessions. Set quality is equivalent, which I think is like one of the ways, typically when we're talking frequency, it's, hey, we can get like, if we do 2 sets of, or 2 days with 5 sets each versus 1 day with 10 sets each, the quality of the sets will be better. Or maybe even more so if we split it up across 3 sessions. That hypothetically, if set quality is equivalent, do you still think more frequency is more conducive to more growth? Like again, if we split it up over 3 days instead of 2?
All right, so you're talking about lower volume. So at 10 sets per week, we actually don't see a diminishing return. So there's actually a newer meta-regression that's by Remmert and colleagues. It's not even published yet, so it's a preprint. So I don't know if they'll make any corrections to this, but we actually see that the amount of effective sets per session go up to 11 sets per session before we see diminishing returns. So you're talking about 10 or less sets. We could technically do that in 1 session. However, there are benefits to higher frequency. We have to look at the interaction. We can never isolate these things in an isolated fashion. Intensity, and volume are all all interacting variables. It's the same type of mentality that a lot of people like to take energy balance and disentangle it to just energy expenditure versus energy intake when they're intrinsically tied. When you modify your energy intake, it modifies your energy expenditure. You go into a deficit, it reduces the amount of calories you burn per day. So frequency is actually, I look at it more as a tool to drive more effective volume. Now, frequency in and itself does have some small benefits. So we're going to have more opportunities to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. You're going to get better skill acquisition and executing. And really what I see with that is it allows someone to practice more often. So say that you were doing only one session training your chest per week and you went to 2 or 3 sets or 2 or 3 sessions per week, you're going to get more practice at that muscle group. You're going to induce less fatigue per session, and generally you're going to have better performance per set. But you gave me this, kind of example where it was equivalent in terms of actual set quality, that we don't see differences within frequency. But I really think that the biggest advantage.
It's not like that actually happens in real life, though.
No, not practically speaking. So we do have some literature that looks at that. Brad Schoenfeld has a frequency meta-analysis from 2016 that found that 2 sessions per week were advantageous as compared to 1. But then there was another meta-analysis that I know that James Krieger was on, where it showed that as long as volume is equivalent, then it doesn't matter your frequency. But at the same time, we have to really look at things from a practical programming perspective. What do we actually see in the gym? If someone is doing higher volume, so say 15 to 20 sets per muscle per week, most times you're not going to have that same quality doing it 1 session per week as compared to 2 or 3 times. So the biggest advantage with frequency is that it allows us to perform more quality weekly volume without undershooting intensity or sacrificing execution. Because if someone is doing 15 to 20 sets for a muscle group in a single workout, those latter sets are almost always junk volume. So by splitting the same volume into 2 to 3 sessions, you maintain better training performance, execution, and fatigue management. And just from a practical programming perspective, I find that to be much more advantageous. Now, will the literature always bear that out? No, because a lot of times if you actually look at even the most recent volume meta-regression or meta-analysis and meta-regression, the average sets per week were like 11 to 12. And I don't think I don't want to say that low of a training volume, but it's really not that high where you're really going to see a drop off. Like I just said, the other meta regression from 2025, which is just on weekly or just on sets per session, found that up to 11, you can continue seeing a linear dose response in terms of more sets, more hypertrophy. Then you start seeing diminishing. You still see it even going up to like 20 plus, but it's that there's a diminishing return after that 11 sets. So I really like to conceptualize it as, I don't want clients doing a muscle group within a session. I don't want them doing more than, say, 10 sets per session, so that we just get right in the safety zone, essentially. So most people, if they're doing a specialization, I'm going to have them at 16 to 20 or even more. So I am going to utilize frequency as a vector to get more quality volume and to spread it out across the week.
Okay. No, very, very well put. And I do think that there's so much merit as well to just being able to practice training that muscle group more frequently across the week. I know if there's a movement that one thing I love about my training right now is I have a lot of movements where I do the same movement at least twice a week, which is great because you get so much better at the skill of it, especially if it's something you're not good at and you can tell like, man, I hit my sets and I don't feel like I quite nailed that. If you have an entire week before you get to like train that again, or at least even that same movement again, it is so much harder to master that same skill. Okay, so when we're deciding specific frequency for priority muscle groups, then are you just looking at, hey, I want to like hit this muscle group with X amount of volume and thus that determines my frequency? Or how are you deciding like how often across the week we're training a muscle group? Like I know when we did chest and bicep specialization, I was training 3 days a week for both of those.
Yeah, so my frequency decisions are based on a combination of things. So I'm looking at muscle physiology, I'm looking at fatigue, I'm looking at clients' recovery capacity, I'm looking at the volume target for that mesocycle, then also I'm looking at their schedule. How many days can they actually train? I'm going to say this off the bat. If someone trains 3 days or less, we're not doing specialization. Just because it's going to be very difficult to be able to drive a greater stimulus on those days and also hit maintenance volume for other tissues. And so I just haven't seen that be advantageous. So it is something that necessitates, in my opinion, 4 days or more. So really what I'm looking at is first I'm looking at the muscle size of what we're training and the fatigue cost. So smaller muscle groups like delts and arms recover quickly and create less systemic stress. So I've seen that they can be trained, say, 3 to 4 times a week without issues. Now, larger muscle groups like your quads, your glutes, or your back generate far more systemic stress, and they're much more taxing. So for those, 2 to 3 times a week is usually the ceiling for most clients. The other thing I'm looking at is a total weekly volume that we're trying to achieve. So if we have a body part that needs and would benefit from higher training volumes, like within the realm of, say, 20 to 25 high-quality sets close to failure each week, There's no way that I'm having someone do that in one session. That's where we use a higher frequency approach to achieve this. Now, let's give the example of 20 sets per session or 20 sets per week. We could divide that into 2 sessions, which would be 10 sets per session, or 3 sessions, which would be between 6 to 7 sets per session. The other thing I'm looking at is session quality and logistical constraints. So if I have a client that has a tighter training schedule or long work days, I'll use frequency to create shorter, higher quality sessions rather than marathon workouts. So instead of 4 like 90-minute workouts, we may do 5 to 6 60-minute workouts. So really when I look at it, I actually went back and looked at a lot of the specialization cycles that I've written this year, and I really thought about, all right, let me look at the actual frequency so I can give you a very direct answer. When I looked at delts and arms, a lot of times we could do that up to 3 to 4 times a week. Back, most times I'm doing 2 to 3 times a week within a specialization cycle. Quads are generally 2 times a week. Rarely I'll have 3 times a week, but that wasn't really something that came up commonly. Glutes were 2 to 3 times a week, and chest was 2 to 3 times a week. And really what the goal was when I'm constructing these specialization cycles for clients is I want to maximize quality. I want to manage their fatigue. I want to fit the client's lifestyle and their schedule. And I want to allow for meaningful performance progression, which is why even if the argument was, hey, we could just jack up volume on a particular body part and quality would be the same, or we could just do it in one session. The issue that I find with that and the constraint that I see with that is that everyone has off days. So for instance, if you only train a muscle group once per day or once per week, you have one opportunity. If that's the muscle you're specializing on, say you're doing 20 sets per week on your specialized muscle group and 10 sets per week on everything else. You got one opportunity to hit that session out of the fucking park. If you had a poor night of sleep, if your baby was up, you were you were insufficiently hydrated, if you didn't have enough, or your nutritional status was off, it could impair your performance on that day. And now you have to wait a week to get back in and to really give yourself a very potent stimulus for that muscle. And then there's also arguments about, we look at Chris Beardsley's work, he will talk about the atrophy that occurs after 3 to 4 days of not training a muscle group. That's contentious of an argument because a lot of that is immobilization studies and bed rest studies. But at the same time, I really think that for most muscle groups, we should be training twice per week. Then when we really get into the specialization cycle, I'm looking at an average of 2 to 3 times a week just to increase that stimulus dial a little bit more.
Okay. So it sounds like basically everything except for delts and arms, 2 to 3 times a week. Delts and arms we can touch on 3 to 4 times a week. Is that like, hey, I would train biceps up to 4 times a week and be okay with that? Or do you find, like, as an example, like, or do you run into, because I imagine there we have to be pretty, the way we're programming, at least I feel like personally, like my elbows get pretty beat up, and the biceps are one that, it depends, and it probably, I guess this really ties into exercise selection, like we're probably doing less linked to bias movements and things of that nature in that case. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself now. I'm kind of answering my own question now that I asked this, but okay, so go ahead.
No, I think it's a good one. And also, I really want to get your mind off of just what we did in our own work together, because I have a lot of training modalities that I utilize that I didn't utilize with you. And then also there's an evolution within coaching. So I will tell you that I have had the opportunity to really discuss at length with many practitioners, including some of my mentors, Dr. Scott Stevenson and other individuals, Nick Rolnick, who actually works he's a DPT, about blood flow restriction. So I will often, if I'm utilizing a 4th session on biceps specifically, and that's because they are doing a arm specialization cycle and someone does have elbow issues or joint and connective tissue issues, a lot of times I'm going to utilize some blood flow restriction so that we're able to induce a stimulus with much lighter load. It's not just the blanketed approach that, hey, we're going to smash biceps, we're going to torch them 4 days a week. Yeah. We also have to look at the fact that there is going to be some indirect volume that's going to come from pulling exercises, but keep in mind that everything is titrated. These are all dials. So if I'm increasing the dial on volume, frequency, and intensity of bicep training, I'm also decreasing the dial on back training. And I'm also going to utilize movements from an exercise selection perspective that is more advantageous for that individual to get a quality stimulus on the biceps to keep, and then on the opposite side of the equation, to keep back actual musculature intact from a muscle maintenance perspective. But there's going to be a lot of movements that are going to be on more isolated fashion for the back that are less systemically stressing. We may not do one-arm rows if that person finds that their biceps take over in that movement. We may be utilizing different exercises in order to target the back, the lats and the upper back that don't have as much crossover to the biceps themselves. So there's many things. It's almost like a Jenga puzzle. This is how I look at programming. Like when I'm dialing the vector up on one, this is the biggest thing. Like we'll talk about mistakes probably in like the next podcast that we do together. But one of the biggest mistakes is that people take, when they hear about specialization, they take their current existing program and they just pile more volume for specific muscle groups on top of it, or they go from a 4-day per week program, they keep that intact, say they're doing an upper lower split 4 days per week, and then they add like a delt and arm day, and they're like, all right, I'm going to get an extra stimulus on that. That's not how it works. Like when you change one day of your training, you need to take into consideration every other day. And that's why when I build out mesocycles, I'm building it out all at once. So even when a client comes to me and they're like, listen, the first month of training, I'm only going to be able to train 3 days per week, but I want to get to 4 days a week. And I will have the opportunity, or I will have the accessibility within my schedule to do 4 days per week. I actually build out a 4-day mesocycle. And a lot of times what I'll do is they will run that 3-day rotation the first 3 days, that first week, and they'll start with session 4 on the next week. So they're going through the same movements. We're getting technical proficiency. We're actually getting the repeated bout effect on those movements. But the reason I do that is actually from a practical programming perspective, because I want everything in balance and I want everything taken into consideration. It's not like if I'm going to add one day in, I usually just have to chuck the program and redo it. You know what I mean? So it's really, we have to consider the fact that this is not just different vectors. This isn't like you hear about length and partials on a YouTube video, someone saying that you get 30% more growth and you say, all right, I'm just going to add this to the program. You have to consider every other variable because these are all interacting variables between volume, intensity, frequency, exercise selection, training intensity techniques. All these things interact with one another, and you really need to balance them out to have the most conducive program for muscle hypertrophy.
Okay. Okay. Very, very well put. And I think we'll be able to make that a lot more clear in the next part of this. Are you sure you're okay with making it a two-parter? I don't want to take.
Absolutely, my friend. Always.
Okay, cool. Cool. All right. Well, in that case, I think this is kind of a good stopping point for this. In the next episode, we can talk more exercise selection, intensity, volume, and kind of bigger picture as well. Hopefully, y'all enjoyed the episode. And thank you so much for being here, dude. It's been great to have you back on.
Always a pleasure.
Any final words before we wrap it up?
Yeah.
Of course, tell people where to find you and anything you would like to plug.
Absolutely. If you guys are fans of podcasts, you're obviously listening to this one. I would highly encourage you to check out my podcast, which is the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness podcast. As Jeremiah alluded to, I do a lot of deep dives on many topics and have done so for years. So there is a vault of information, monologues, and then also really deep dives with some of the best and brightest in this industry. And then if you guys want daily content from an educational perspective, you guys can find me on Instagram at Brandon DaCruz_. And for any one-on-one coaching or consultation purposes, you guys can find me at bdacruzfitness@gmail.com. I just want to say, Jeremiah, it is such a pleasure to be back with you. I'm glad we're able to do a two-parter because we're making up for missed times, and it's really been a pleasure to see how much you've grown and also to play some type of a role in that. And I'm deeply proud of you and also appreciative of our friendship, my friend.
Thank you, man. That means a lot. I appreciate you and your mentorship and your friendship more than you know. So I'm excited that we're going to have a two-parter here as well. But thank you guys for tuning in. Everywhere you can find Brandon. Again, highly recommend you check out his stuff, his coaching, his podcast as well. I will link up in the show notes, and we will catch you guys next time.